Hello boys, I am making this video because I think that it could really help you to remember everything that we saw before you went on vacations, and also it can help you to understand what we are going to be seeing now. So in order to make this link between things, I think that this video will be great for you. So remember, we were studying the Greeks. And well, I just want us to be sure of where we are. If this is the map of the world, remember this is just a projection. We would try to find ourselves here, just North Africa, in the Mediterranean Sea. And once we are in the Mediterranean Sea, this is what we are going to be seeing. So you can identify really easily, for example, here Spain, then Italy, and finally over here, this is Greece. These are the lands that we have been talking about, actually, precisely this screen over here. So, first of all, if you remember, we need to talk about the first settlers, the first people that lived in this territory. So if you pay attention here, they are this green group, and this green group is called the Western Hunter-Gatherers. The West is always going to be Europe. You will always find Europe referred as the West. So the Western Hunter-Gatherers are basically the bands or the hordes that hunt and gather around Europe. These are the first groups. They are just bands. If you remember, you have in your notebooks this way of organization. That is the horde or the band that live in camps, so they are transhuman hunters. All their tools are made out of stone, so that is why this is called the Stone Age, because all the tools, all the technology was made out of stone. And remember, they are hunter-gatherers. That means that they are moving around. That is why they are transhuman. Remember that transhumans is when you move around trying to ensure your survival. It is not out of tradition. It is for survival. That is the main difference between transhumans and nomadism. Nomadism is out of tradition, while transhumans is out of survival. So you're moving around, hunting animals, gathering whatever food you can find. And of course, in order to do this, you need to be living in camps, right? You cannot settle in cities. You don't have the technology, you don't have the social organization in order to live in a city. So all you can do is move around and try to survive, right? And of this period, the only evidence that we have is archaeological sources. We, of course, do not have any written sources because they didn't know any of these alphabets nor ideographic, and of course, most certainly not phonetic alphabets. They just didn't know how to write. There wasn't a lot of technology. They just had the most rudimentary technology made out of stone in order to survive. Remember that the horde is a group of families working together for survival, and usually this group of families is no bigger than 50, maybe up to 100 people, no more. Larger bands are just very scarce and would be very, very weird to find this. I mean, it is not impossible, but it wouldn't be really common. So after that, what we are going to be seeing after the Stone Age, we will see the Bronze Age, the period of history in which the tools are going to be made out of metal, but of course not yet out of iron, but out of bronze. If you remember, we have studied these three societies, the Minoans, the Cyclades, and the Helladic societies. Just as a reference, you can, well, your book doesn't include any information about the Cyclades, but you can find information, and we actually read these pages in your book in pages 208 and 209 for the Minoans, and pages 210 and 211 for the Mycenaeans. So well, if you remember over here, if you pay attention to this timeline over here, what we can see is that the Minoans were the first settlers of this land, and they settled here in Crete. They were already states, their way of organization was the state, and the settlement pattern was the city. Remember that the city and the state are usually going to come together in one package. Why? Because the city implies a lot of people, and you really cannot organize that many people with simpler ways of organization. You require a very strong way of organization in order to be able to sustain a city. And also, of course, a city implies certain technology that will allow you to keep those people alive, that will allow you to, of course, to feed them and so on. And all of these are characteristics of the state, because the state is going to manage or administrate all these goods for the society. So the Minoans are certainly the first people to settle here. A bit after that, actually, not so, not such a few years after that, a nice time after that, we have the Cyclades, and the Cyclades are going to be these islands over here that we have in the Aegean Sea, between the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. This over here that you can see in the middle, this is the Aegean Sea. So that is why this group of societies are called the Aegean societies, because they live around the Aegean Sea. The Minoans, as you can see, are going to establish this great empire between all the islands, starting from Crete and expanding to the Cyclades. And by the year 2000 before Christ, remember that the years are not really important, but if you would like to know, by the year 2000 before Christ, the Minoans are going to be absorbing these societies. The last societies that are going to emerge in these territories, or that are going to settle in these territories, are the Helladic societies that, well, more or less by the year 1050 before Christ, are going to go into war with the Minoans and are going to be able to to get control of this society, and they're going to integrate all of these societies into one huge empire. However, this empire didn't last too long, more or less 100 years, that is a very few time. Now, for example, the Aztecs ruled as an empire in Mexico more or less at the same time. It is not a long time, it is a very, very short period of time. And after that, well, we are not sure about what happened. Actually, you can read about it, and we discussed this in the page 210. That we actually do not know very well what happened to the Mycenaeans. They were warriors, but perhaps there was a plague, perhaps there was a climatic problem, and well, we don't know what happened, but they disappeared, and this society simply collapsed. There is also another theory about the Sea People. The Sea People were a group of societies, well, groups of peoples, in this case it is correct to say peoples, that fought cities such as Egypt and other societies that we have studied more or less from this Bronze Age period. So it wouldn't be weird to have them also attacking the Mycenaeans and defeating them, or making such a heavy time, making so difficult for them to making so different for them to survive, that this society simply collapsed. What is important is that after this Bronze Age came the Dark Ages, and in the Dark Ages what we are going to see are new societies that are going to be inhabiting this land, and they are going to come from the north, and they are going to occupy all the regions that they were that were occupied, before by the Mycenaeans, by the Minoans, and so on. These human groups are called the Greek tribes. They comprise basically four groups of tribes: the Dorians, the Ionians, the Achaeans, and the Elodians. But it is very important to take into consideration that even if we call them Greek tribes, they are not tribes, they are tribal confederacies. The Dorians are several tribes, and several tribes that unite, that are working together. The Ionians are also several tribes. There is not only one tribe called the Ionians. What is very important here is that, as you can see in the way of organization, a tribal confederacy will become a state when the common leadership that they share becomes permanent. When the central authority that is uniting, or that is ruling this group of tribes, becomes a permanent central authority, then we're going to see the birth of the states. And these states are going to be basically, and the most important of them, are going to be Sparta and Athens. So again, they're going to be settling in cities, and the best way to describe this are actually polis. Remember, not cities, not city-states, but polis. The tools are going to be made out of iron. In this case, we have iron as the main material. And well, the historical sources or the sources to study these societies that we have is, of course, archaeological sources. Archaeology is going to be one of the sources. But also we have this great Greek poet, Homer, that is going to be speaking about this time. So it is more like a secondary source. It is not a primary source in the sense that he lived during the Dark Ages, but it is a secondary source in the sense that he is writing about these Dark Ages. So you can also find a bit more information about this in the page 212 of your history book. So uh, remember, it is very important, and you have a brief discussion here in page 214 and 215 about the city-states, but it is absolutely wrong. Everything that your book says should be taken into consideration again. Because it is not the same. Look over here, the last part says a powerful city grew into an even more powerful city state, also called a polis. However, it is not the same. It is actually wrong to say city state because it gives us the false illusion that you have one state ruling exclusively one city, over one city. And that is not always the case, and in many cases, states grow larger than the barriers and the frontiers of a city. The city is not going to be the limit of a state in many cases, and we shouldn't think that the power of the state is limited to one city. It is not like that. So for the Greeks, it is more accurate to speak about a polis. A polis will give you the right idea about how a state may rule over more than one city. And in many other of the ancient cultures that we have studied, this is also the case. For example, in the Sumer societies between the Tigris and the Euphrates, there was also the case in which many cities could be ruled by only one state. There were great unifiers between the Babylonians. There were great unifiers between the Achaeans. So it is not weird, and it is actually not the case that the state is limited to rule over one city. The thing is that for the Greeks we have a term, polis. For the Babylonians and for the Sumerians, we do not have quite much such a particular term to refer to this idea. So if you remember, something that will become really, really important is the competition that will emerge between Sparta and Athens. And this will start to grow and grow until we have a very large war. But before this war, the Greeks are going to get an alliance, but we're going to speak about that in a few moments after this. First, I want to finish just with these topics that we were seeing before we went on vacation. So, in the Archaic period, we're going to have this human group that, well, the human groups that we know as the Greeks that you already know, the Greeks that you usually have studied. I am not speaking about these Aegean societies that inhabited the Greek territory. No, in this case, I am speaking about the Greeks that you have studied throughout all your life. Again, the organization should be called the police, but what I want you to pay attention here and what we are studying in this moment are the leagues that are established between Sparta and their allies, the Peloponnesian leagues, and the Athens, and Athens and their allies, the Delian League. And well, it is very easy to remember because this region over here of Greece is called Peloponnesus. And well, it is only logical to have the Peloponnesian League in the Peloponnesus. So, in the settlement pattern, again, is going to be the cities, but cities that are ruled perhaps more than one city by a state, so that is why we call them polis. What is very, very important here, not only the Peloponnesian Wars that are going to happen during the Archaic period, but mainly that the sources that we have for this period are archaeology, yes, but we have the rise of the pre-Socratic philosophy. So, if you remember, we have all of these schools of pre-Socratic philosophy. It is called pre-Socratic because it is philosophy that predates, that comes before the times of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. That is the most common philosophy that you would study nowadays, even. The sources here are doxography. What is doxography and why doxography? Well, because we are speaking about such past times, this is so long ago, that you actually cannot find the original papers written by these authors. So all we have is what we can collect, that is doxography. Doxography is what we can collect from what other authors said from these people. For example, if you read Aristotle and if you read Plato, and if you, well, Socrates, you cannot read it, but if you read Plato and Aristotle and many other authors, they are going to be speaking about what these other authors say. So you can collect all their opinions about what these people were saying, and that is everything that you have. You don't have the original books, you don't have the original writings, all you have is what you can collect from what other people said, that they said. So that is doxography, this collection that you can make out of just some sayings that you have from other people. These pretty much indirect source, well, direct sources, but really secondary sources. So there are several schools, and what they are all discussing is the origin of everything. Why? This is very interesting because starting in this period, they are not thinking that the gods were the origin of everything, and that is a very nice step in Greek history. Instead of thinking that the gods were the fathers of everything and that the Titans created time and so on, no, they're trying to wonder how nature created itself, and that is very, very interesting and advanced of their part, from their side. So, for example, we have the school of the Milesians, for example, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. They thought that the origin of things was basically within the elements. That, for example, Thales thought that it was water, and Anaximander thought that it was the apeiron. And the apeiron is like this energy that works with the oppositions. And for example, if something gets cold, the apeiron is going to balance things out in the universe, and it's going to make some hot things. And this balance between the opposites or the oppositions is the apeiron. Anaximenes is going to think that the origin of everything is the air, and that everything is made out of air, but that some air may become thicker than other air, and that is why we have the solid state of matter, and you can touch your body and it is solid, even if according to Anaximenes it would be finally made out of air. And actually, maybe you can think that this is a crazy idea, but it is not. Take into consideration that the simplest atom that exists is the hydrogen, this atom with one electron and one proton. So if the simplest atom is made out of one electron and one proton, and that is the hydrogen, and the hydrogen is the gas, as many more protons and electrons are added to that atom, they are going to be creating much, much heavier atoms, such as carbon. But carbon is just a collection of hydrogen, right? Just a collection of hydrogen in one same atom. That is what is happening in our sun, right? Our sun of hydrogen is becoming a sun of helium, because the atoms are uniting in nuclear fusion in the sun. So it is not so crazy if you think that basically one proton and one electron is the hydrogen. Well, all the more complex atoms are basically made out of more and more hydrogen in one same atom, right? The Pythagoreans, if you remember, they believed in the number, but at least Pythagoras was not the author of the theorem of Pythagoras. We only call it the theorem of Pythagoras, but it is not the theorem, it is not something written by him. It was said many centuries after that he was the author, but he certainly was not. Why can we say that? Because the original doxography, that is the first sayings that we have about Pythagoras, do not include this theorem. It was only many years after that the theorem was included, but in the first doxography you cannot find any traces. So you can very clearly see how in history things were changed and they started to add this idea as being part of what Pythagoras was saying. But this was something that was thought later on, many years after. They decided to say that Pythagoras was the author, but in the original doxography you just cannot find it. Then the Ephesian school, where we can find Heraclitus. Heraclitus is going to be a part of the philosophers that you are going to be debating very soon. And Heraclitus is going to be saying that basically the origin of everything is change. Fire, yes, but fire not as fire itself, as lighting a fire. No, fire in the sense of ever-changing movement, of always a process of change. That is the origin of everything according to Heraclitus. Then we have the Eleatic school, in which we have Parmenides, and Parmenides, as opposed to Heraclitus, is going to be saying that everything remains always the same. And actually, that there are not a lot of things, there is only one thing that exists, and that thing that exists is never going to be changing. It is an eternal existence, and it has no movement, it has no change, it only exists. Finally, the atomists, which best example is Democritus, thinks that everything is created out of atoms, and that the atom is not really what we think nowadays that is the atom. Of course, the idea was taken from here just for the name, but the idea of the atom is not having protons and electrons and neutrons. The idea of the atom is that all the matter and everything that exists is made out of very little things that cannot be divided anymore, like the smallest brick that you can have in a construction. And of course, that does not apply to our modern atom. Why? Because you can subdivide the atom in protons, electrons, and neutrons, and you can subdivide those in leptons and quarks and so on, right? So it is not quite the same idea. Now, that is what we have seen so far. That is just summary. So what is very important is how we can see this change of the ways of organization. Like in the beginning, the first settlers, as you can see here, were hordes or bands. Here, horde or band. And then the next societies, the ancient societies that we are studying, are states. So we are going from here, that is the first way of organization that is actually a society. Do not forget that the family is the basis of all societies, but no single society can become, no single family can be thought of as a society. Every single society is made out of several families, but no single family can be a society. The horde would be the first society because it is a group of families. So we're going from here all the way to here, the state kingdom. And that is, we need to understand how is that change happening. Mainly, what we can see, one of the most interesting changes here is the tribal confederacy going into states. So we are going from here to here, right? And how does that change happen? Well, that change is going to occur when the common leadership of the tribal confederacy becomes a permanent common leadership. So that is when the leaders of the tribal confederacy become the permanent leaders of these groups of tribes. Now, the first wars, as I was telling you, the first time the Greeks united against the Persians. The Persians are a very interesting empire. If you pay attention, they are occupying the territories that we have studied in Mesopotamia, and they are going far into the east. So they were also trying to get into the west. They were trying to get into Greece. So the Greeks united against them and they fought them and they defeated them. This is a picture of King Xerxes of the Persians. So they were able to defeat them. Remember, the Greeks had basically two enemies, Greeks and the Persians. Yes, the Greeks were enemies of the Greeks. And you can find more information about the fight or the war against the Persians in page 222 of your book. Now, yes, they fought against the Persians, but they also fought against their main enemy, that is themselves. So, as you can see here, these are basically the alliances that the cities are taking. So, there is the alliance of Sparta, and that is in green, and you have the alliance of Athens, that is in red. So, these cities are going to be fighting for the control of Greece, and we are going to see that this is going to create a lot of damage to Greece. What damage? Well, first of all, as we read in your book in pages 200 and give me a second, 236, well, Athens had the control of the agency, so they had all these ships that were able to battle in the ocean. And Sparta had this great army that was able to fight inland. So it was very difficult for them to establish a winning side, because some of them were very good fighting at the sea and some of them were very good fighting by land. So at first they are going to settle in a peace, in an agreement, because they're going to say, okay, no one can win. But very short after that, war is going to break out again, and in this case, Sparta is going to ask for help from an enemy that you would never imagine. They are going to ask the Persians for help in order to defeat Athens, and the Persians helped them, and the Spartans were able to win the Peloponnesian Wars. However, these wars were terrible for Greece. They devastated the land, they devastated the cities, they basically destroyed everything, they destroyed the economy, they destroyed the city. So it was time for Macedonia to take advantage of that. Macedonia is going to take advantage of this situation, and King Philip II, that was the father of Alexander the Great, conquered all Greece. He took advantage of this disarray, of all this chaos that existed in Greece, and he is going to conquer the Greek lands. So King Philip II was assassinated, he was murdered, he was killed, and after him his son Alexander the Great started to rule. So the Greeks thought that Alexander wasn't strong enough and that he was going to just lose everything that his father had achieved. But opposite to that, Alexander was a very, very strong person, and you can find more information about him in pages 242, 243, 244, 245. So you can find a lot of information about him, and he was actually, there is a myth saying that the first time that they saw that he was very, very strong was when he faced his horse for the first time, Bucephalus, because he was a very wild horse, and when he was a teenager, Alexander was able to tame her. He was able to rule over this horse, and he was able to ride this horse even when nobody else could. So this was like the first signal that Alexander was going to be a great warrior. And well, actually this is the great empire that Alexander was able to build. Not only he conquered Greece, but after he conquered the first enemy of the Greeks, that were the Greeks themselves, he moved on to conquer the next enemy of the Greeks, that are the Persians, and he was able to. Now, of course, he moved all the way to the east, but one of the first places that he conquered was Egypt. I want you to pay attention that this is only the lower Egypt. The higher Egypt, the highlands, were actually lost, and the way of organization there was particular. They had actually a set of queens and so on. But by these years, all that great empire that we studied in Egypt, that was the High and Low Egypt, was lost. We only have the Low Egypt in these times. So he was not only a very great warrior, a very great warrior, he was also someone very smart. His father, Philip II, asked Aristotle to become his teacher, and he taught Alexander the Great in person. So in this case, like if you go here, we were speaking about the pre-Socratic philosophy. Now we're going to speak about the Socratic philosophy. Basically, the philosophy started with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and basically only them. So Socrates was the teacher of Plato, but he was killed in Greece because, well, he made too many questions, and that wasn't good business for the government, so they decided to kill him. And Plato, being afraid of suffering the same destiny, decided to write a lot of books that I recommend you. They are called the Dialogues, and there are a lot of dialogues, and he is writing everything pretending that those were the words of Socrates. Perhaps Socrates did actually said that, perhaps these were actually Plato's ideas, but Plato was not going to risk being killed for expressing his ideas. So he's going to say that Socrates was the one that said everything. So after that, Aristotle actually became one of the main students of Plato, and he's going to be the teacher of Alexander the Great. But Aristotle was not only a student of Plato, he was much, much greater than Plato. Aristotle was the greatest philosopher that existed for many, many years. Nowadays, we still read him. Nowadays, we still discuss him. Nowadays, he is the basis of logic. Actually, Aristotle was the first guy to invent and to discover and to develop logic. So there are very important differences between Plato and Aristotle, even if Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. For example, Plato believed in the world, not the world, the world, the planet of the ideas. He believed that there were two worlds, the visible world and the ideal world, and that the only real world was the world of the ideas, and the visible world was just like a failure, like well, not a failure, it was like a copy of the ideas. It was the expression of the world of the ideas, but the world of the ideas was perfect, and the world that we can see is not perfect. It is an unperfect representation of the world of the ideas. As opposed to that, Aristotle thought that we are not supposed to study the ideal of something, but how something actually is. So Aristotle actually destroyed the ideas of Plato with a very simple argument. He said, okay, you say that there is an ideal man, and that from that man we are only expressions of that ideal. We are imperfect expressions of that ideal. But it is obvious that some people are closer to the ideal, and other people are very far apart from the ideal man. So we can think that there are two ideas of men: a man that is closer to an ideal man, and a man that is far away from the ideal man. But of course, there is going to be a group of men, there are going to be a group of men that are going to be closer to the ideal man, and there is going to be a group of people that are obviously going to be closer to the non-ideal people. So we're going to have a third man, right? There is going to be a third idea of a man that is not quite the ideal man, but is closer to that. And we have a fourth man that is a man that is not quite the unideal man, but is closer to that. And you need to have more and more ideas, because you have more and more men that differ from this idea. So he says it is absolutely ridiculous to think that there is an ideal man, because we would need to have an ideal for every single type of man that exists. And if we need an idea for every single man that exists, then, well, just study the man, right? Why do you need to study the idea that doesn't even exist? You cannot see it. You just say that it's a perfect model, but where is it, right? So Aristotle basically thinks that it is better to study the things that exist, the things that we can see, instead of pretending that there is a world that is perfect, because let's face it, that is not the case. So actually in this painting you can see that idea. Plato is saying that we should study the things that are like ideal, that are in the top, that as we know do not even exist. And Aristotle is saying no, we should study the things here of earth, the things that we can see. And of course Aristotle is much more brighter. So this is very, very important, boys and girls, and I need you to understand it. These two guys that you're going to debate, Heraclitus and Parmenides, they were pre-Socratic people, right? And if you remember, well, philosophers, and if you remember, Heraclitus is saying that everything is changing, while Parmenides is saying that nothing changes. Well, Plato actually took these two ideas and synthesized them into one single idea. And he said, okay, and actually, if you read this book that he has in his hand, it says Timeo. And Timeo is the dialogue in which he talks about this. In Timeo, Plato says, okay, so everything eternal, eternity, doesn't change. Eternity is what Parmenides says. But time is change. Time is what Heraclitus says. So he makes this very important distinction, saying that it is not the same time and eternity. Time is change. Eternity is not change. And of course, we can see again this idea of having an ideal. Eternity is the perfect model. It is a single thing. It doesn't move. It doesn't change. And time is, let's say, the setting into movement this model, setting into movement the eternity. When eternity is set into motion, then that is time. So again, we have this basis of the ideal, that is eternity. Eternity is the perfect model, and time is placing into motion an imperfect representation of the model that is eternity, that is time, right? It is basically the same as we were discussing previously about the ideal man. In this case, the ideal is eternity, and time is the set into motion of that model that, of course, is not going to be perfect, because only the ideal is perfect. Now, Aristotle is also going to have very interesting studies about time, and he's going to say, well, basically, time is what happens, everything that we can measure between before and after. You said a before, so for example, now is the before, and you wait 1, 2, 3, 4, now is the after. So everything that you can measure, and it doesn't matter how you measure it, but everything that you measure in between the before and the after, in between these two markers, let's say, that is time. Of course, now we have other ideas, but what is very important is that this guy, Plotinus, took the ideas both of Plato and Aristotle. So we are seeing how Heraclitus and Parmenides become one same thing in Plato. Then Aristotle has his own ideas, and the ideas of Plato and Aristotle come down to Plotinus. Plotinus basically destroyed Greek philosophy. Why? Because the great thing about Greek philosophy is that Greek philosophy was able to explain everything without the need of gods. That was, let's say, what was very, very interesting about this philosophy. Before them, of course, it was mythology, and everybody had the ideas of gods. What was very different of these authors is that they are not discussing reality in the term of gods. No, they are discussing reality in terms of reality itself. So Plotinus destroyed all of this, and he went back to the ideas of the gods, to divinity basically, because he was a Christian. So it is not the ideas of gods, it is the idea of God. So what he did is that he took the ideas of Plato and Aristotle, but he said that everything that exists is like a ring, like a circle, and in the middle of it there is divinity, and everything is surrounding divinity and looking towards it. The reason for everything, the center of existence, is divinity, is God, basically. But he's repeating the same arguments as Plato and Aristotle did, just adding the idea of God. So by the 5th century after Christ, we have Saint Augustine. And Saint Augustine, we're going to read a bit of Saint Augustine this trimester, but he enjoys to fight a lot. Every time someone says something, Saint Augustine is going to write a book arguing whatever that people said. So in this case, there were some people asking one very simple and perhaps one very silly question. What was God doing before the creation? And Saint Augustine wrote a whole book trying to answer this question. What was God doing before the creation? And what was his answer? Well, basically, he was not a very honest guy, because he said that God told him, no, that God enlightened his soul, and he was able to see that God wasn't doing anything before the creation, because God is eternal. And the fact of doing something implies action, implies movement. So that is only within time, and time can only exist after the creation. So what was God doing before the creation? Absolutely nothing. It is not only a question, a well thought question, because you cannot do anything out of time. In order to doing is movement, and movement does only exist in time, and time started with the creation. So before the creation, there was no action. But basically, those ideas, as you can see, come from Heraclitus and Parmenides, and they went on to Plato and then to Plotinus. But Saint Augustine said that they were given to him by God, when obviously we can see all this history of philosophy here. Well, Alexander the Great actually had this great issue, as he was, as I told you, the student of Aristotle. He was this great warrior. He grew his empire all this size, but he came to the borders of here, to the borders of India. And in there, he found a war technology that he was not able to defeat. He was not able to win these battles. Why? Because in India, they would use elephants as a means of war. He would face, his army was made out of men and horses, but in India, the armies also included elephants. So this was a war technology that he wasn't able to defeat, and he died in a battle because of this. What is the problem? That Alexander never got any descendants. He didn't have any children. So his empire was divided between his generals. So the eastern part was left to Seleuco, the Middle East part to Lysimaco, the Greek part to Cassandro, and finally Egypt to Ptolemy. Ptolemy was his general, and he became the first pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Why the Ptolemaic dynasty? Well, because they all came from Ptolemy. And if you pay attention to his crown, it doesn't include the bolter, it only has the snake. So that means that he is only the pharaoh of the lower Egypt. Remember, the upper Egypt was lost. They are ruled now in a different way. They are not part of the empire anymore. So there were actually 13 Ptolemies, and this is what I wanted us to reach. All of these are descendants of Ptolemies. They were pharaohs of Egypt, but they weren't Egyptian. They were Greeks. Now, what is really interesting about this? Of course, they may seem like a lot, but some of them only ruled for a couple of days, like Ptolemy the 11th. Some of them only ruled like a couple of years, so it is not such a long period of time. What is really interesting is that when we reach to Ptolemy the 13th, actually his father, Ptolemy the 12th, decided that he should share the kingdom with his sister, that they two, Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII, should rule. But when he died, of course, not really them, but the people in power behind them, they decided that only one could rule. So there was a civil war in Egypt, trying to decide if Ptolemy or Cleopatra should be the real rulers of Egypt. And right in that moment, Julius Caesar from the Romans arrived to these lands. And Julius Caesar and Cleopatra fell deeply in love. I am going to reproduce very briefly a very beautiful song from my favorite opera that precisely speaks about the great love that Cleopatra and Julius Caesar felt for each other. Well, I am going to reproduce it and then I am going to explain it. So that was Julius Caesar singing all the happiness of his love. He's in love, so he's singing like a bird. In this case, Julius Caesar sounds like a woman because this is a Baroque opera, and in those times, in the times in which this opera was written, the main characters were played by castrati, by men that would sing as women. So this great love between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar almost destroyed both empires, both Egypt and Rome. But well, we will study what happened to Julius Caesar after this great love, after this great chapter of history. Ptolemy XIV is going to rule, and Ptolemy XIV was also a brother of Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra. But Cleopatra didn't want him to rule, he wanted Caesarion to rule. And maybe this name may sound funny to you, Caesarion, well, because he is the son of both Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. He was the product of this great love, and he was the last pharaoh of Egypt. In here, with Caesarion, the pharaohs end forever. Why? Because Egypt gets conquered by Rome, and Egypt just becomes like the private lands of the emperor of Rome. So why did I want us to see all of this? Precisely to reach to this point. The point of collision between the history of Greece, the history of Egypt, and the history of Rome. Because guess what? Precisely this is what we are going to start studying. Rome.